What's up, Barnhill family, and welcome back to your home for all things combat sports.
Yo.
So, guys, today we are going to give you Arman Tsarukyan's 3 keys to victory against Islam Makhachev at UFC 311. And we're going to get into all of the things that stylistically could match him up well against Islam and sort of some things that he might need to look out for if he is to have success. So, Nick, without further ado,
Let's get into
I think
it.
we should get into point number 1. And point number 1, as we were preparing for this video and discussing, was a lot of diagonal movement is needed by Arman in this one. You know,
Right.
that helps him avoid the clinch. So we'll just call point number 1, utilize diagonal movement to avoid the clinch and the takedown opportunities for Islam Makhachev. So
like it.
what that means is Arman can't just back up if he's being pressured by Islam.
Right.
He actually needs to look for and create his own angles. So I want to get your thoughts on that. What are some ways he can implement that, and how could that, if he's able to have success with it, sort of turn the tides a little bit?
Yeah, that's a great key. And if you go back and watch their first fight, which is a very different fight than what we're going to see next, but if you go back and watch that fight, there were a lot of moments where Islam had a serious advantage in the clinch. And Arman maybe he didn't have the answers for it, or maybe the world hadn't been exposed to the best sorts of defenses to Islam's style of offense. But I do look for Arman to really avoid the clinch that he was finding himself in like he did in the first fight. Because if he doesn't, he's going to wind up getting tripped to the floor like he did last time. It leads to more grappling exchanges. And as we know, Islam Makhachev is all about controlling the fight. He loves to control the pace when they're on the feet. He loves to control the distance because he's pretty good at keeping his strikes long and keep his opponents at bay. But the control really sets in when he gets into that clinch, eventually tries to get his opponent to the ground, and then looks for the even more control and dominance on the ground. So Arman can really put a wrench in all of those plans by getting very explosive and very aggressive with his movements, particularly the diagonal ones, when Islam does close that distance and look for those clinch opportunities that we've kind of made him known famous for now. He's so good at doing that, and he's so good at finding his trip variations from there that it's almost too risky for anybody to even entertain that realm or that range with Islam Makhachev, because you know where you're going to wind up, which is on the ground, and that's an even worse territory when you're fighting Islam Makhachev.
Yeah, and the other thing to note too is Arman's a shorter fighter. You know, Islam's relatively tall for 155.
Yeah.
And so if he gets you in the clinch, things tend to be really bad for you. Islam has developed a really good striking game over the years. He's got great knees up the middle, but mainly he uses that clinch to off balance and get his opponent to the ground where he likes to control.
And he's strong from there. He's so strong for the division that I think when he gets that full plumb position, it's just very difficult to fight out of.
Yeah, it's devastating. And I mean, talk about zapping the gas tank of a fighter who otherwise has a great gas tank. Yeah. When you're in the clinch in a full plumb with a fighter like Islam Makhachev, just having your neck pulled down and you're constantly having to fight that and use all of your muscles almost like a deadlift to, you know, every posterior chain muscle that you have, you're having to utilize to not get kneed in the face. It really is exhausting, but Arman can avoid all of that with really crisp diagonal movement. But we're not just talking about what he can do to avoid certain bad positions. We're talking about how can he exploit certain positions by doing these things correctly. And if you use diagonal movement, you end up in an angle against your opponent that can be very advantageous for you and very disadvantageous for them.
Especially Arman, because he's a wrestler.
Right, i.e. striking or wrestling. So if you can get to the side of your opponent, if you just think of Vasily Lomachenko, for those that are boxing fans out there, one of the things that made him so successful in his boxing career is that he was always able to cut angles on people.
Yeah.
And when you get angles on people, you're almost on the side of them and you're punching them and they're completely helpless because they're not in a position to return fire to you. So if Arman can get to the side of Islam, that will open up some of those nice overhands that he likes to throw from a position where he's relatively safe. And it also will allow for some of those level changes so Arman can start to work some wrestling of his own, which does actually bring me to point number 2. And that is counter wrestle with Islam when he's working his chain wrestling. You know, Islam Makhachev is one of the best chain wrestlers in all of MMA, and he's kind of laid the blueprint for how to control on the feet, how to work takedowns together, both judo style from the plumb position, sort of stand-up trip off balancing, and really good wrestling technique as well. And then when you look at the opponents that Islam's had before, every time Islam shoots or tries to grapple with them, they just want to tuck tail and get out.
Right.
But Arman's also a really good wrestler himself. And so if he counter wrestles to Islam's wrestling, one, he's going to start to exhaust Islam a little bit, because when you're wrestling, that's, to me, the most cardiovascularly demanding thing that you can do in MMA
100%.
is wrestle. And if you're the one just doing all the offensive wrestling, you're not getting nearly as tired as your opponent who's defending.
Right.
But when you counter, then you force your opponent to actually, we could see some really cool wrestling and grappling exchanges in this. But more importantly than that, Arman hits hard.
Yes.
And where do you get the opportunities for big? I mean, Islam's striking's very buttoned up these days. He stays in range. He stays long behind the jab. He doesn't take a whole lot of chances. And that allows him to not be in bad positions very often. But, if Islam shoots in on a takedown and Arman counter wrestles them, goes for, a back attack or something like that, it's going to force Islam to scramble. And in those moments of scramble, Arman could find a big shot that could actually change the tide of the fight. So I think it's really important that Arman not just avoid the wrestling with Islam. And I don't expect him to, because he believes in his wrestling, and he believes, even if he may be, incorrect, he believes that he's as good of a grappler as Islam Makhachev, and I don't think he should shy away from that. No. I think he should use counter wrestling to open up shots and land some big power punches.
Yeah, I totally agree. I don't think you should ever concede because you feel like you're lacking in one realm or the other. Even if you're a high-level striker with very little grappling experience, you can't show your opponent that you're afraid of grappling with them, because that's when you show the most weaknesses, and then you leave all your vulnerabilities right there, and they're able to expose you. So yeah, I think it's really important that Arman Tsarukyan, avoids all that clinch, like you're saying, and then finds these angles. And when he's throwing his strikes, they're heavy-handed punches for the most part. He will kick from time to time, but I tend to believe that with Islam Makhachev being so good at catching kicks and being such a good wrestler, that he's going to be very calculated with when he does decide to throw kicks and where he decides to throw them. I don't think we're going to see a whole lot of body kicks from Arman, because Islam can catch those. And while Arman's probably less afraid to get his kicks caught than most people in the division, it's still something that you don't want to do in a fight against a guy like Islam, where everything is so close and the margin of skill is so fine that every little moment counts. You can't just be throwing something willy-nilly at a guy like Islam, because that could cost you a round. It could cost you an opportunity, a moment, which could ultimately cost you that belt. And for me, this feels like Arman Tsarukyan has everything he needs skill-wise to go out there and do the best against Islam Makhachev that anybody else has done so far. But like we've talked about, these three keys to victory. The second one, in my opinion, is so important because Islam Makhachev is seen as this, daunting wrestler. But I feel like Arman Tsarukyan, being the shorter fighter, having tons of explosive power, and he's a very fast, young, body type. I have a feeling if he goes out there and really puts some wrestling pressure on Islam, he can zap the gas tank early on, and then they'll both be fighting a little bit more exhausted later in the fight. But he'll also kind of make Islam respect his grappling a little bit more. And if he's able to do that, that can open up those big strikes that we're talking about. I don't really see him going and having a ton of success with the kicks. So I think he needs to use those wrestling feints, those angles you're talking about, to set up heavy overhands, to set up some jabs, and then use those feints as your jabs to work your single legs, your double legs, or whatever intro or entry that you want to shoot Islam Makhachev with.
Yeah, and I think that the counter, Islam loves to control. He loves to control. Islam wants to ultimately control you on the ground, but that control starts on the feet.
100%.
And he gets his takedowns. He's very methodical. He takes his time. He gets you down. And then once he gets you down, he's like glue on you because he's pulled all of your momentum. And you don't have, you can't just shrimp and bridge away from Islam Makhachev. He's too good. He's got too good a pressure. How do you avoid getting locked down on the ground? You counter wrestle. You create scrambles. So even if Islam does find finally get you down, it's not going to be that solid takedown that he wants, where it's like, boom, you're on the floor, you're basically stapled to the floor.
Right.
And he's the one that's stapling you there. So if Arman can create those moments of scramble, not only will he make it easier for himself to get back up if he does get taken down, which I do expect him to get taken down in this fight. I mean, even as good of a wrestler as Arman is, I think he's still going to be on the canvas at some point, but better to be on the canvas in like a scramble sort of situation than just be locked down by Islam Makhachev.
For sure.
Because then you're just riding out the round. And if he does that a few too many times, he's won the fight just off of control.
And lately, Islam's looked so good with his finishes. Not just submissions, but strikes as well.
Exactly, and he's finishing you. So that kind of brings me to point number 3. Okay. And you mentioned it a little bit just a second ago. I think Arman really needs to... Arman's very good with his hands.
Yes.
Islam and Arman are going to probably be fighting in opposite stances for at least the majority of this fight.
Yes.
Islam's going to have the advantage given his stance with the body kicks, because the liver, that his body kick would register on the liver, whereas Arman's would register on the spleen.
Right.
Not great to get kicked in the liver or the spleen, but if you had to take one, if you had to suck it up and get kicked in one, better the spleen than the liver. So,
which oddly, I don't want to interrupt, but oddly, the spleen can be more devastating, but in a fight, the liver hurts way more. It will shut you down. The spleen won't shut you down.
Exactly. So. And so I think Arman needs to get fundamental with his boxing.
Yeah.
He's really good with his feints. He feints to throw big punches. He also feints to throw level changes. But Islam lately with his striking has been looking really good at range.
Yeah.
Really good with his head kicks, really good with his jabs and his setups and stuff like that. I think that you can disrupt Islam by getting in close on him, but you have to be careful to avoid the clinch. As we said in point 1, that's a key factor here.
Right.
Arman does have to avoid the clinch. But if Arman can get in on Islam by feinting, jabbing, and then working a big overhand, and then getting inside and maybe throwing some uppercuts, working the body a little bit. You know, Islam is a guy who seems to have an unlimited gas tank. What's one thing that can really help zap a gas tank? It's absorbing some really devastating body shots throughout the fight. So I think Arman needs to strike chaotically, not stupidly.
Right.
But like Islam's going to be the more controlled, more calculated, more measured fighter.
Right.
But if Arman can make this a bit of a brawl on the feet and neutralize that range and height advantage that Islam is going to have by getting inside with good feints and jabs to set up overhands and set up body shots, keep the kicks to a minimum, keep them, you know, let's say midway up the thigh and below.
Yeah.
I think that's going to be his striking advantage.
Yeah, I think bringing chaos to the fight is actually a really good idea. And it's controlled chaos, because you can't just go out there and put yourself at risk. But I think Arman Tsarukyan really does need to focus on sort of implementing all of these aspects together. Like, we need to use these feints to set up the hands, right? But then once we start to touch the hands a little bit, now we can show some level changes and have them worried about the takedown. And I do fully believe that Arman Tsarukyan is going to change levels and blast a double leg at some point against Islam, probably multiple, but he wants to prove that he can take this guy down, that Islam and Team Khabib's wrestling is not just this unstoppable thing that nobody has figured out. I believe Arman's going to look to do some offensive wrestling himself, but I really think that the punches and the feints set up the wrestling. Now, once he gets inside to the wrestling, it's going to be very difficult to get Islam to the ground, and that's why I think what you said with the tight punches, the hooks and the uppercuts, that's where that'll come into play. And if he's a little bit aggressive and chaotic on his entries and what he's doing on the inside when Islam has him there, that can make it a little more difficult for Islam to find things like the clinch and to find his opportunities to find the body lock and whatnot. And that's ultimately where I see Arman Tsarukyan having the most success. He's got to get in. He's an explosive fighter. Everybody knows that. But we can't just be explosive in one range. He needs to be explosive on the outside. He needs to come in with a ton of velocity. And then when he gets inside, he needs to do a lot of damage. And you really don't worry about the kicks that much. Do your damage early on. Eventually, when you start shooting in like that and you don't have to punch halfway through the combination, you can finish those takedowns. But I'm looking really forward to this, because I think there's a lot of improvements in his game plan from the first fight that he can improve on, and I'm excited to see what him and his team have come up with.
Me too. Guys, thanks so much for watching this video. Make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell, because the very next video that we're going to drop is the flip side of this one. We're going to talk about 3 keys to victory for Islam Makhachev. And then, of course, as the fight gets closer, Nick and I will make our final prediction for the UFC 311 main event.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you in the next one.
Peace.